So today we are going to talk about general watercolor properties. We're going to talk about how to start a watercolor painting and how to kind of set up your workspace. We're going to discuss wash types, brush strokes, color organization, and then I'm going to demo for you a value scale and some different texture or experimental watercolor techniques. Then I'm just going to touch on kind of how we are going to clean up in our classroom. So let's say we are going to start out with a watercolor painting. It is always going to be my suggestion that we have both our sketch done in pencil, we have our watercolor palette, we have our water cup, we have a secondary palette, which you can use for mixing specific colors and creating variations of those. Now I will be using the palette itself, so I will be using the top part of my watercolor color palette. Now, I also, when I have a sketch like this, like to get rid of some of the graphite because unlike acrylic paint, watercolor does not mesh well with graphite and it will remain there unless we erase it. So I'm going to use this gummy eraser and I'm just going to kind of roll on top. And that's going to get rid of some of the darker areas of graphite. As you can see, I already did that over here. If we don't have one of these and you don't want to use this, you can just use a regular eraser and just kind of buff it out because we don't want to get rid of our lines completely, but we don't want them to be too dark. The other thing that I will always suggest that you have is paper next to your watercolor palette for testing before you put it on your final paper. And I will show you what that looks like as we're going forward. Here are a couple of different wash types. We have the flat, which is essentially just one layer. We're not reducing the pigment at all. A gradient, which can be very, very subtle, can be a little bit more intentional, but it's going from a dark to a light, the same way that we would in any variation of a gradient, but this is only using one color value. This is a variegated version of a wash as we have different colors kind of blending into each other. This one is a little bit drier. This one is a little bit more of a wet on wet technique. Same deal on this side, except instead of doing stripes, we did wet on wet dots. This time we did wet on wet dots, but we did less water. If we're talking about brush strokes, there are a lot of different kinds. We can talk about blade, which is when you would use a flat brush and you would use the side edge. A side is using the face of the brush and making a mark just like this. You can also, here's an example of a blade, and if you want to do a blade, you want to make sure that you're using that tip, and you want to make sure that when you are doing it, you do not have a lot of water on your brush. A weighted line is when we have color in a brush, and we vary the thickness by pressing harder and less hard as we go along. Now, this is really good to do with any brush type. This can be done. However, it does seem to be most successful when we use things like bamboo brushes. A stamping method would look like this, and you literally are just stamping whatever the base of that brush is. Now, the different brush types that you use, you're going to have different looks with that stamp. So if I'm going to use this mop brush and I do stamps with this looks a little bit larger and has a different look depending on the brush that you use. If we're talking about pointillism, we are discussing having the same kind of method as a stamp, but we really only want to use very small edge of our brush. And we want this to be very, very, very small. And pointillism is a style of art where essentially artists layer lots and lots of little dots to create a composition. A dry brush is exactly as it sounds. And basically, we would take a brush that was very dry, we would dip it into our pigment, and we can do kind of strokes like this, and it's going to have a little bit of a different effect than if we were to do a wet on wet wash. The water's not going to go as far, the pigment's not going to go as far, but it is going to have a unique layer to the top in terms of its texture. Now, when we're talking about color organization, we have here using alizarin crimson, primary yellow, and ultramarine blue. You guys will just say red, yellow, and blue. Now, depending on your palette type, I have a different palette than we have in class. There is going to be slight variations of this scale. But just using these three colors, I was able to create my secondary and my tertiary colors, and I was able to make them quite pigmented. Now you can make any of these darker or lighter in variations of values. When we do that, we want to make sure that the darkest version of our color is being used the minimal amount of water. So as I'm going along, let's say I want to create a new, just like I mentioned before, I will test out my color on my test paper first before I put it on my final paper. And I do this because as of right now, this is not quite the pigment that I want. I want it to be more color and less water. So I'm going to dip my brush in and have less water added to that. Now here is going to be what I'm going to represent as my darkest value. This still looks fairly transparent. So I'm going to add a little bit more. And I'm going to cover this whole thing up to represent the darkest version of my color. Now, as I go to the right, as I am intentionally lightening my colors, the only thing I need to do here is not add white, but add water. So here already, I only added one real dip of water, and I've already had a very clear difference in values. We have this value scale we are seeing here. I actually use the lift-off method, which I will tell you about in just a second, to remove a little bit of pigment from this back area. I actually can let this dry and do another coat of this to make this area a little bit darker. But the whole concept of using a value scale and considering value with watercolor is that water and pigment is all you need to change from dark to light. Now we are going to consider some different textures, some different experimental ways of creating texture. First, we're going to talk about doing a lift off. What that entails is putting color on your paper. You want to do a lot of water. You can do in any real combination you'd like, but more water the better. I can take a Kleenex, I can take a tissue, and it's exactly as it sounds. I am going to absorb different patches of this. Now this already created a unique look. We can do clouds with this. This is a very common way of creating clouds. When we're talking about a sponge texture, we would take a sponge and pigment. I'm just dotting on this color. The more water you add, the more it will move. The less water you add, the more it will look like the texture of the sponge itself. Resist can be used with a lot of different materials. One is masking tape. You can also create different designs using that positive and negative space. You can use rubber cement, you can use masking fluid. This I used a fine line applicator, but there are a lot of different ways you can do this. And I actually had one layer underneath this, and I just kind of pick up and peel that masking fluid. As you can see, the layer I did first is obvious in this design that I created, and the second layer did not touch that design from the material of the masking fluid. This example, I only used the white of the paper. I created negative space, and that resist actually created as a design. Now here, what we could do is an example of a sgraffito technique using scraping. If we have a dry color base, we can use something like an X-Acto knife, and we can remove the color. We can create designs the same way. It has a similar format to resist. You can scrape off while it is still wet. Using something like a palette knife, you could also use the X-Acto knife. And here we're just getting rid of that top layer of the paint. The next method is to use potentially Now this is a process called splatter. You can use a toothbrush. I don't have a toothbrush, so I'm going to use this dry mop brush. And it's exactly as you would imagine. You have a little bit of water, you take your pigment. You want to put a lot of pigment on your brush. You can kind of tap it just like this. Now I have a lot of ink on my brush and it's also clearly making quite a mess. Depending on your surface and depending on how much you want this to move, it is always a good idea to have a base the way that I have. I can make sure that this is the color I want over here on the side. I often mix my colors on the palette that I'm using, but you can also mix them on this test paper to ensure that it's the color that you would like. The last process is using salt or rice here to remove excess pigment. Here you can see some of the texture that was created with the rice. It has a clear difference in value. If we are using salt, now I did not let this dry completely, so you can only see a little piece of how it can be affected. This is another example of what it might look like if you use rice, or what it might look like if you use salt. When we are done with our palette, when we're done for the day, we want to make sure that we wash our brushes. Now, watercolor is a lot nicer to our brushes than acrylic paint, but the first thing I would do is take my water cup and just rinse out the pigment that's in here. Now I'm not pressing up and down, I'm just kind of tapping it on the side in the direction of the brush. Then I will dry it off. I can do so with the Kleenex I used. Now, these are clean after they have used water and you have dried them. What we will do is make sure that our stations have been wiped down, our palettes have been rinsed out, and there is no remaining pigment on the top part of our palette.